Hello everybody, welcome to Continental Update. This is where we update you on things you know and what you don't know around Africa and the world. We are still talking about the sixth region of Africa, the Caribbean islands. Some of us in Africa are aware and some are not. So today we are going to talk about Cuba. Cuba is a country within the Caribbean island, and this Caribbean island represents the sixth region of Africa. The name Cuba comes from the Taino language. The exact meaning of the name is unclear, but it may be translated either as where fertile land is abundant or great place, Cuabana. The first enslaved Africans were taken to Cuba in 1513. Many of these first Africans were forced to work in the mines of Cuba as replacement for the disappearing enslaved indigenous Taino Arawak laborers. The first large groups of enslaved Africans to work underground entered from 1520 onwards. About 800,000 slaves were imported to Cuba, twice as many as those shipped to the United States from Africa. It was then a colony of Spain, and slavery was abolished in 1886, remaining a colony until the Spanish-American War of 1898, when Cuba was occupied by the United States and gained independence in 1902. Christopher Columbus named the island Isla Juana, but later it will be called Cuba, which comes from the local Native American name of Cuabana. The first Spanish settlement on Cuba was Baracoa, which was founded by Diego Velázquez in 1511. The official language of Cuba is Spanish or Cuban Spanish, a form of Caribbean Spanish that the vast majority of Cubans speak. Lokomi, a dialect of the Western African language Yoruba, is used for religious purposes and so only as a second language in Cuba. Mario Diaz-Canel is a Cuban politician and engineer who is the third and current first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba. As first secretary, he is the most powerful person in the Cuban government as the president of Cuba. Liz Peraza, born on March 28, 1971, is a Cuban politician and former tourism executive. She is the current First Lady of Cuba as the second wife of Miguel Diaz-Canel, the first secretary of the Communist Party and the president of Cuba. Lisa is the first woman to be called First Lady in Cuba. There is first time in everything in this world. Veja, the national dish of Cuba, is a meal that is steeped in history. This rustic, humble dish so perfectly tells the story of the country's culinary and cultural evolution over the last half-century. Its nearest neighbors are the United States, Bahamas, Mexico, Cayman Islands, Jamaica, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Cuba is tropical and mostly flat with mountains in the southeast. Plantains are another Cuban staple food, same as in West Africa and some of the African countries. Cubans themselves are, as recent DNA studies prove, partially Africans, but Cubans' expression of Africa culture involved primarily as a mechanism of extension, survival, and adaptation for the African men and women that experienced slavery, dehumanization, and racism on the island for 350 years ago. According to 2012 national census, which surveyed 11.2 million Cubans, 1 million Cubans describe themselves as Afro-Cuban or Black, while 3 million consider themselves to be mulatto or mestizo. Thus, a significant proportion of those living on the island affirm some African ancestry. The quality of life in Cuba varies across different aspects. Cuba has a strong focus on education and healthcare, with a high literacy rate and well-developed healthcare system. However, the economy faces challenges, and access to certain goods and services can be limited to the Cuban people. Cuba has strict laws on possession or trafficking of illegal drugs. Cuban courts tend to hand out severe penalties for those convicted of drugs-related offenses. In Cuba, there is a saying, Pack all luggage yourself and don't carry items for anyone else. Cuba prohibits the import of all meat products and fruits from any part of the world. Most Cubans have family living in the state, and their welcoming nature means they are happy you have chosen Cuba as your destination. You also don't need to worry about guns or violence when you are over there, as they have very low levels of theft or violent crime in the country. The overview of religions in Cuba. The Cuban population has historically been Christian, primarily Roman Catholic, although in religious population has grown substantially in recent decades. Catholicism in Cuba is in some instances profoundly modified and influenced through syncretism. The truth facts about Cuba. Christmas was banned for 30 years. Burning rag rolls is a New Year's Eve tradition. Cuba is home to the smallest bird in the world. Cuba enjoy having visitors in their communities. Doctors in Cuba are highly skilled than any other country. Cuba is a relative safety country to visit or to start a new life. Cuban cigars are legendary. Cuba is a very diverse country. Cuba is bigger than you think. Voting in Cuba is legally mandatory. Cuba exports doctors. Havana is the capital of Cuba. Fidel Castro survived 600 assassination attempts. So Cuba found within Caribbean island, which represent the sixth region of Africa. Many years ago, large numbers of Africans began arriving in Cuba in the late 1700s, only after the British took the prospering Havana from Spain during the 7 Years' War and occupied both the city and port from 1760 to 1763. If you don't know, now you know. This is Continental Update. Kindly subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching.